Welcome to the Founders Chat. Every week, I talk with founders about their journey building a company. Today, we have Richard from FlexHaul with us. Welcome.
Thank you, Alan. This is Richard. I'm the founder of Flexhalt.ai. We're building AI automated solutions for the supply chain logistics industry.
Okay, that's amazing. And can you tell us a bit more? What is the stage? When did you start?
Yeah, sure. We're just right at the stage where we have onboarded customers and now we are having revenue. This month, we actually hit thousands of transactions already. So definitely, a long time coming, but also very pleased with the results here. Now, to your question as to how I got started, I was at TikTok from 2023 to just about a couple months ago. While I was at TikTok, what I realized was that it's really interesting what they're trying to do with live streaming and shopping, et cetera. It's the new way of engaging customer, which is to use content and basically, creating that demand, right, in order to get people to shop. However, there's an issue when it comes to fulfillment. Basically, when I dog fooded TikTok's product, it took about 3 weeks for me to get the item that I purchased. And by the time that I got the item, I was already disinterested. I forgot the fact that I bought such item. So what happens to, and this is not just unique to me, what happens to a lot of consumers, and we see this internally as well, is that people might come and browse and whatnot, but they might just either churn out at the transaction flow where they have to place the order, or and they would go and shop at, for example, Amazon, right? Because Amazon has a very built out logistics network. They're able to have 2-day delivery for most of the customers here in the US. And so what I saw was that there's a lot of optimization that could be had for any e-commerce, serious e-commerce players coming into the market. So that's the reason why I started FlexHaul.
That's amazing. And then, who are your customers? So basically, it's retail companies that are importing, or it's the manufacturers that want to export?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I started out with building a lot of integrations with parcel carriers, et cetera. I thought that in order for any supply chain operation to be serious, we need to first allow them to have the tools to compare price and select the best tool for themselves before we can start automating and start realizing that 2-day delivery dream. So we started out trying to find a market. About at the beginning of this year, we went out to talk to different customers. That includes people in the manufacturing industry, industrial, as well as just e-commerce, shoppers and shippers rather. When we talk to e-commerce shippers and when we talk to warehouses, we realize that there's more demand actually from the warehousing side. A lot of these companies, right, they will pool together orders coming from different shippers and different e-commerce vendors, right? So naturally, their volume is just a lot larger than ordinary e-commerce sellers, and from there, they really need tools where they can easily batch fulfill their orders, as well as to easily figure out which pricing, etc. A lot of times, they might have to reroute their packages, or they have to use different vendors for different parcel types depending on where they're delivering to, for example. So what we found out was that our ICP are warehouses actually, and so we started going around that area and started building solutions for these buyers.
Okay, this is great. So basically, the strategy is you get these warehouses and they come with a bunch of different retail and different manufacturers that they already are working with. Cool.
Yeah, exactly.
And you mentioned you were in TikTok. I saw you were in Facebook before and you were a software engineer. So how did this transition work?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I used to be a software engineer. I actually came from data background. Started with being a data scientist, and then later on becoming a data engineer, software engineer. So had a very I had a lot of interest to build things. I like to just tinker around with new technologies, etc. However, one thing and one drawback about being a software engineer is that we're very deep into the weeds trying to figure out what new technologies there are. But when it comes to operating a business, right? What happens is that I keep realizing this is that you know uh, being a technical person has certain biases and drawbacks where we don't see enough about the business landscapes of things. Especially with traditional businesses like logistics, supply chain, and e-commerce even. Right? the crux of the value actually lies in operational excellence. As you can imagine, with logistics, right? People are operating on thin margins here. And so what really matters is time as well as efficiency at the end of the day, as well as quality, right? And so this is something that, I thought that, well, I didn't realize, but then later on I realized that. And I think that technology can play a big role if we can do the right partnership with industry folks.
Yeah, it's a tough one. I can see how you have a clear advantage now, but it's tough usually to move from software engineering to start a business. I've been there, and there are so many things that we're not used to do. In my case, I didn't know how to sell something, and it's a
Yeah.
completely different skill.
You're absolutely right. It is a complete different skill. And what I realized along my journey is that as much as you're trying to figure out what to sell outside and what to build, it's as much as to figure out what you can actually sell, right? Internally. So that actually comes down to, my skill set as a software engineer. So the way that I, have gotten, customers is to say, hey, look, I can enable your solutions for you and, I could do it at no cost for you, right? Because I can build. So is there a way that, for example, we can have a partnership together? And that narrative is actually drawing a lot more people in to collaborate with us, right? So I would say that it is one thing that being somebody technical can definitely have blind spots and biases. But at the same time, if you realize that that's actually a superpower, you can actually have that and help you with your sales.
I completely agree, and it's a smart way of using it. All right, and is there something from your early story that most people don't know?
Well, so part of me is that I've always wanted to start a business on my own ever since I was in middle school. And this realization really came in because I'm an immigrant, right? And so, growing up, my dad was overseas. And so it was just me and my mom. And so everything has kind of fallen onto my shoulder just because, I'm the only boy kind of in the family here. And so, growing up, kind of have to shoulder a lot of burdens. So I thought, well, if I'm going to, be, this responsible, et cetera, well, I might as well also push my ceilings a little bit more and try to figure out if there's a way that I can operate something on my own. And the other thing is that, as I grew up and, being in the tech industry for the last 15 years, it's also one thing to realize that at the end of the day, if the company is not yours, you're just a worker over there. And so you really don't have a lot of control over your own destiny, as well as, for example, your time as well. Not that I have much time right now, to spare, but I think that it's that, hope, right, that I kind of live with, as I kind of grow up and work myself through all these years, that entrepreneurship is, the natural way for me to go on.
I completely understand you. I have been there. Yeah, sometimes it's really hard because you have this hope, you start a business, and then it can get really tough. Like, well, you probably have been working more than when you were working for somebody else.
Yeah.
So at some point, it's super normal to that and think about what if I go back to the corpo.
I definitely think about that. And I definitely think about, well, going back to what you said, I definitely work a lot more than I used to. But I'm also the kind of person who likes to just overload myself with things. I think that it's owing to, again, my immigration background where, I just have to naturally carry a lot of things. And so to me, I always make the joke with other people that I wouldn't know what to do if I, just relax and not start a company, for example. Having said that, though, I want to say that there are a lot of great things that come through entrepreneurship, regardless of the result, right? And why I say that is because, as an entrepreneur, for example, I have to review contracts, for example. I never had to do that as a software engineer. I now have two employees and I have to check over their work and I have to make sure that they're, going along the right direction, right? So in the past, when I was a employee at a company, I might not think at the level of what I do now if I was just trying to, make sure that the code works. But now I have to make sure not only code works, I have to make sure that, for example, internally, the process makes sense. It doesn't take us a lot of time, to do. And whatever we develop, right, we have to develop, much quicker. And that forces me to think through a lot more, not necessarily just in the details, but also on a broader term of things, because you have to think about this operation kind of like also a factory, right? In a sense that when you talk to the customer, for example, you say, hey, look, I can deliver X, Y, Z. But you better make sure that you can deliver X, Y, Z. Otherwise, the other guy is looks, just like a joke, right? Because, I give you a chance and you couldn't deliver that, right? So, and then on top of that, other outside of delivery, we also have to make sure that the deal is structured correctly because as you strike out, there's a lot of times that, for example, if you want to make sales, you might just be tempted to agree to certain terms that's not necessarily favorable to you, right, down the road. So those are things that you kind of have to just think through. Fortunately, now that we have OpenAI and ChatGPT, obviously you could talk about it, with AI and get some more ideas. But from that perspective, we also onboard an advisor to help us kind of go through these contracts and whatnot, right? Just have a second set of eyes. And on top of that, each direction that you go on will really determine as to how big your company can be. If you started in the right area at the right time, your growth can be a lot easier than if you started otherwise. So those are all things that you have to think about as an owner, right? Your survival literally just depends on
Yeah.
yourself.
Yeah, I fully agree. Actually, I have been jumping in between working for a company and starting a business. And then I went back to the working for a company, but I always was growing professionally super fast, faster than if I had stayed in the company. Because as you mentioned, when you're a founder, it's like you got promoted 5 times and now you have all the responsibility. And then
Yeah.
when you go back to a company, you have a lot of skills that you wouldn't have developed otherwise. Communication skills, selling skills, self-organization, accountability. There are so many different things. And then, yeah, if you hire people and you need to manage, you need to motivate, leadership skills. So I fully agree with you.
Yeah, absolutely. On leadership skill, especially, this is something that I'm really proud to, about, especially because my team now, are they're growing a lot. I would say they're growing a lot faster than I am when I was at their age. And part of that is just that you let them take on a lot of responsibility. Just because, at smaller companies, you don't, have enough people to handle everything. But having said that, when it comes to leadership, there's also a lot to be said about having patience and just having that empathy to understand from the other person of what really going through. Because, as I'm, operating the business, a lot of times I cannot think at the same level as, let's say my employees. And so sometimes there's that detachment. And so one thing that I would say, really helped me a lot when it comes to leadership is what I've learned back when I was in Meta, actually. So when I was in Meta, is one of the culture within Meta that a manager should meet with you every week just to develop your career. They took a huge emphasis on developing your career. I've never seen that, anywhere else. I've never seen that at TikTok. I've never seen that during the time when I was a consultant, right? And so, because of that, I was able to share a lot more in depth details with my people. And because of that, they're able to understand kind of the urgency of things and they're able to prioritize as such. And because of that, they're able to actually grow so much. And the other thing is actually AI tools. That actually has alleviated a lot
Yeah.
of my work.
So yeah, well, actually, we can jump into this. I want to ask you, how are you using which tools are you using, and how are you leveraging?
Yeah, we started out with ChatGPT when we started this project. It was just me and my first hire talking to ChatGPT 24/7, figuring out, how should we build things and whatnot. What are some of the logics good to have in order to build into our system, right? Pretty soon we realized that, well, if we're translating, for example, our product requirement and code in a different platform, because we used to code on this thing called Visual Studio, which is a development tool, pre AI based tool, right, for us to develop code. And that actually took us quite a bit of time just to iterate and translate the context to, ChatGPT and then translate it back into code and then implement that. Later on, we migrated over to Cursor. We've never looked back. Obviously, Cursor is growing super fast for a reason, right? I use it such that it's able to read through all of our code, but it's also able to, for example, talk to our backend. We use GCP, Google Cloud Platform, for our backend to handle, all of the customer requests and everything. We use Cursor actually to actually look over our backend from GCP as well. Cursor is able to execute what is called shell commands in order to do a lot of things for you, such as, hey, read through all of my logs in the backend for the last 12 hours and tell me all of the errors that you see and suggest ways as to how we can correct it. And because of that, we're able to actually push down our SLA to less than 12 hours. So a lot of times when a customer, actually even before a customer surface to us that there are issues, we usually proactively just tell customers that, hey, look, we see these kind of things in the backend, and these are some of the things that we suggest that you do. For example, if it doesn't lie with us, if it lies with us, when we detect these kind of issues, we automatically just fix it within an hour or so. Um, because especially because Cursor is able to kind of help us to pinpoint where that issue is, so that it could just kind of self seal itself. So that's the way that we use AI for the time being.
That's insane. I didn't know Cursor could connect with the Google Cloud or with the servers and read the logs. That's amazing. I'm a software engineer as well, and I worked in Google site reliability. So basically, we did a lot of digging to investigate issues. And yeah, like when we started using AI, everything is much easier. And now to see that anybody can have access to these amazing technologies, it's amazing.
Yeah, I want to also say that not just with debugging and everything itself. We also use Cursor, for example, to plan our project, right? So the way that we do it is that I would typically have a chat with ChatGPT first. The reason why I still use ChatGPT is because ChatGPT 5 is one of the best models out there, if not the best, actually. And if I use Cursor for this, I'm gonna have to pay quite a bit of money for this. So what I usually do first is to get ChatGPT to help me write a PRD, what is a product review document. So in that way, we can consolidate all the specs and everything that we want to do with a new flow, new product feature, etc. And once we have something that's more fleshed out, what I do is I take that PRD and then translate that with Cursor into actual plant. Cursor now has this functionality where you can, for example, plan out your project. And so what it does then is to read through the PRD and give me suggestions as to the exact changes that it needs to make, right? Obviously, you still need to tell it as to what Cursor should watch out for. For example, all of the database details and all of these things. We still need to, have some iterations on that. But I would say that the, you know, as AI matures, it's able to do more and more to execute on more complicated workflows and whatnot. And that's the way that we're currently using AI.
Sounds great. Okay, and now coming back to before you mentioned, well, you explained how the idea was created. You saw the need when you were at TikTok. The orders were taking so long, but you mentioned before as well when I asked that you had some near burnout or pivots at the beginning. So was there something that you were doing differently at the beginning, and now you learned and you applied learnings?
Yeah. So in the very beginning, I want to admit that I did not do as much product market kind of digging as I should have. But in all honesty, this is something that comes kind of with experience. It's iterative, right? In a sense, as opposed to if somebody has been in the industry for quite a long time, then, maybe the person will understand the problem a lot more. Then they we get into other kinds of issues. So, respective to our conversation here, in the beginning, I started just writing integrations with guys such as FedEx, UPS, USPS, and all of these guys. And so it was an iterative approach to us in a sense that we wanted to sell what we have already built, right? And so if we don't have anything built, for example, then we wouldn't sell that. So the logic goes is that, we're going to connect with all these large vendors first and then try to test the market and try to see, what else we can build, etc. And so as we, kind of go forward, with building that platform, and as we talk to more and more people, what I realize is that there's actually been a lot of platforms that actually built similar features where, for example, ShipStation, right? They're connected to Amazon, Shopify, and all the platforms that you engage in sales activities. And they're connected to USPS, UPS, FedEx, and all of these other guys. And so we quickly realized that if we were to compete on this kind of round in e-commerce, with their customer set and not having a fuller feature than they do, then I don't think that we have a market here. That actually forced us to look into the problem, looking into, digging deeper into warehouses operations. And that's where we started landing upon the fact that we probably need to build, for example, trucking flow as well. So trucking is a little bit different than parcel. Parcel is just, let's say it might be first mile, last mile, where you have to deliver your parcel to It could be a certain warehouse, could be your customer, etc. That's kind of already taken. Now, what we realize is that in this country, there's 90% of all the trucking companies own less than 6 trucks. And in this country, I think that less than 25% of the trucking company actually are on any sort of software. And so a lot of these guys are still doing, for example, Google Drive, Excel, well, not even Google Drive, but they're on Windows, right? They use Excel, etc., to kind of engage in their business activities. And you have a lot of these platforms, for example, from the old days, such as the load boards and whatnot. That's where I would say they're Craigslist equivalent of trucking, where you post your loads. For example, you tell you put it on the platform saying that, hey, look, I got this many pallets in my warehouse right now. I need to get this out from A to B, and I need to deliver by a certain time, etc. Who wants to take it, right? That's kind of the idea. They don't take care of payments and whatnot. It's really just the information, pool here. So the brokers then will come and, contact the shipper and say, hey, look, I got these trucking companies who are willing to take it. Here's the price. Are you willing to, let me handle it, etc. So that's kind of how usually these kind of things happen. As you can imagine, in this industry, the traditional way of doing things is still very dominant. And so, this is kind of what we're breaking into here. And what we realize is that there could be a way where we can build, I want to call it a brokerage in a way, but it's much more, I want to say free market in a sense. It's kind of modeling after Airbnb for hosts, where you can list out your capacities and take loads from there. What I realized is that in the past, so for example, you have a couple blow-ups, right? Like Convoy, for example. And today there's actually another company that's going through Chapter 11 bankruptcy right now. It's called Transportation. And the reason why is because Convoy, per se, they're trying to automate brokerage with price haggling, et cetera, using AI way of doing things such as price prediction, et cetera. The problem is that the real world is not necessarily just driven by data. For example, what really caused them to have an issue was during the pandemic, when everybody was at home and everybody started buying a lot more things, et cetera. Initially, they were doing quite well. They were scaling. They were able to raise large rounds because, everybody was wealthier and a lot more people were buying things. But then, come 2022, 2023, we're emerging out of the pandemic, where people started switching their consumer consumption behavior to buying services as opposed to buying goods. And because of that, volume went down. But as you can imagine, with AI models, they don't typically take care of these drastic drops as easily, just because in their data sets, they just have never seen that. And so their models typically cannot adjust as fast. And because of that, they became uncompetitive as a broker, as you can imagine with all the brokers, right? This is where human brokers have an advantage, where they can quickly cut price and get the loads moving and whatnot, right? And so because of that, Convoy, because their dependency on AI, they ended up not making it. So ended up getting acquired by FlexHaul, for example. So those are some of the things that we realized along the way.
Yeah, it's a lot. I can see that now there is a huge opportunity because people are not really well. You mentioned that people are already using some technologies. Few of them quite outdated, maintaining an Excel in a local computer. So you are offering kind of the the infrastructure for these warehouses, and this is what it's like a web. I can picture like a web solution, and they have everything there, everything in the cloud. It's AI powered, and they get like the best deals faster, right?
Yeah, exactly. The thing about selling into enterprise, which our business is, right, engaged in B2B selling, is that some of these traditional software, they really dominate, right? Even though they're really expensive, et cetera, but because they have trust in the market. And so enterprise customer, they tend to not just kind of pinch on money. Obviously, they will. But when it comes to these kind of solutions, they also want to make sure that if they use it, they can use it for multiple years at once. And so they don't typically switch as much. And so that's what you're seeing. For example, Oracle and SAP solutions still very much dominate the market. And, for some of the smaller carriers, because there's no mid-market and kind of SMB tier kind of solutions. I mean, there are, but it's not really as prevalent. A lot of these guys that they just default back to using Excel, for example, phone calls. Right?
All right. So now I'm going to ask you a more personal question. It's about how does a regular day looks like to you? Do you have a regular day?
I don't think I have a regular day. Every day kind of changes. A regular day, I would say, from the meta level would be just me trying to think about, at least 5 to 10 times at every given moment in time that, what should I do? What else is working? What am I not doing? What can I push on more? So you get very OCD thinking about those questions.
Yeah.
So, sorry, to add a little bit there, I would say a typical day is just me waking up, get a pot of coffee, make sure that I'm ready to go, and do as much work as I can, whether that's solving customer pain points or prospecting for more customers. And just engage in my meetings and whatnot, and then at night, I try to take some melatonin and put myself to sleep. Otherwise, my brain will be too active. Right? And you get your I don't know, if lucky, I guess 7 hours, 6 7 hours of sleep, and then you wake up, do it all over again, and you do it months, weeks, on end.
And do you have any routine like doing sports to keep you sane or meditation, something like that? Or it's
Oh
just
yeah, you're right.
hardcore?
That is one thing I should do better on. Recently, as I get really busy, I haven't been doing it this as much, which I should. But I try to, go to the gym 5 to 6 days a week, actually. So it's a combination of, weight training plus cardio. That's what I do.
Stressful situations. Did you have any inflection point that you had to put some limits or you change some habits drastically?
Yeah, that's a really great question. It's a question that I forgot about because I've kind of like optimized for this, a while ago. But yeah, you're kind of right. You know, I think the mindset shift for me is that you realize that once you start engaging in sales, you start realizing that just because you can build, and this goes back to being a software engineer again, just kind of living in the Silicon Valley, you get the sense that maybe if I just build, people will come, right? Like that's kind of the thing that hey, I built a better mousetrap, and you will come. Well, first of all, there's a lot of questions there because how do you know that you're building a better mousetrap? First of all, and second, just because you build a mousetrap, well, I mean, there's a million other, better mousetraps out there. And unless you're, a paradigm shift, like for example, this mousetrap actually goes to capture mouse for you, as opposed to, just, snapping on, the mouse if it comes, then you really don't have a selling point, right? And so what I had to do was to take on gradually, more a bit proactive thinking and understanding, for example, customers and delivering, solutions for them, et cetera. Ultimately, going back to your last question, gets me to work basically 24 hours a day. So, so yeah, there's an inflection point. The inflection point is that you meet customer and you get your ass kicked, and then you realize that shit, I'm not doing enough.
I did there, and usually it's when you have the product. I don't know if it happens then to you, but you have the product, and then it's like, okay, people are not using it. I need to do something about this, and then it's when
Yeah,
you realize.
exactly. Especially at that point where you put some effort in, right? That you're like, all right, well, hey, this is my baby, and now it's great. It's, I'm so proud of what I created. And then you go, it's like, yeah, not, most people are not proud of what you created. It's like, yeah, you got to do more here.
All right, so then I didn't ask you this question, but I'm assuming you're a solo founder.
I'm a solo founder. I have, 2 employees. The reason why, and I know that in Silicon Valley, they like to say, hey, look, you got to get a co-founder and stuff, which I, partially agree with. Having a co-founder is great because different people have different brains, and you could uh, have a better division of labor and more efficiency. From an investor standpoint, that makes total sense. Now, the one thing though is that I founded a company in the past, and I've had co-founders, which I think that this is a solution probably because time was different. Back in 2021, 2020, I founded another venture capital firm, and I was trying to raise capital back then. What I realized is that in good times, people tend to work on good vibes. So they'll only work with you because it feels nice. You can actually make money really quickly, and so on and so forth. Now we're entering into a bear market, I would say.
Great. So yeah, about having a co-founder, I have done both. One time it went well. The second one it didn't. Usually when it doesn't work as easy as you expected, and you need to persevere a lot, financial stress. There's like a bunch of different ingredients that yeah sometimes it just doesn't work, and people are in different contexts, different situations. So yeah, it's really hard when
Yeah,
somebody has
and,
to
and I
leave.
want to say, adding a little bit more there. The reason why I didn't onboard a co-founder this time is because, learning from last time, right? Obviously, if you want to get alignments, et cetera, if the other guy, just doesn't see you eye to eye, and really depends on the maturity of you both, right? It could create a very toxic situation. So you know that of all the startups that fail, 70% of which are somewhat related to basically co-founder breakup, right? So this is something critical. So one conclusion that I had was that you want to make sure that you build something up, so then that way, if the other person joins, you guys are not just gonna try to figure out, hey, who's who, and who's bringing more results, et cetera. And that's part of the reason why I wanted to kind of spearhead this initiative before I bring somebody on. Um, so yeah, that's the rationale there. The other thing is just that right now, back in the days, it's a lot easier to gain tractions and whatnot. Now it really takes a person with a strong character and perseverance, right? Patience, in order to tough through this kind of market. Right now, this market is not the best, right? All the deals are consolidating. Sales is, not moving as fast. And so you really need just somebody who, can buy into your vision as much as you do, and, have that perseverance and discipline to carry through. And usually, that person is just you, right?
Yeah. And now that you mentioned this, why do you think? Because I have been seeing the exact same thing, that despite everybody posting social media, yeah, now is the best moment with the different AI tools. I think it's extremely hard now to build a business. And I think this is because the standards raised a lot. It's okay, yeah, it's super easy to build a prototype faster with AI, but at the same time, other thousand companies are doing the same and customers expect more, faster, and cheaper. So this is what I have
Yeah.
seen.
Yeah, so around that point, I would say that the typical human element is still there, right? I think that from a business's perspective, it's not a problem to find people to collaborate with, but to find somebody who you can really trust is still a very difficult part. I think that this is a big problem, especially from the pandemic time, just because everybody started working remote, and now just like you and me, we're connecting online here, right? And so because of that, it's really hard to have that trust, especially if your iterative loop and your communication skills might not be up there. um I would say that even though it is difficult, but if you can have empathy for your customers, if you have the discipline to execute, if you can get your house in order, and that means that your employees kind of aligned and everything, and deliver something up to expectation on time, and close the loop with your conversation, I would say that you could still build trust around there. It's just that right now, I would say that people are less so about prospecting as opposed to kind of just focusing on what they do and whatnot. So you're right that sales is a little bit harder, but I think that this is just a matter of time, because the economy is from for the longer term kind of horizon, people are always going to work together and have a division of labor, and so I think that with the rate cut as we're having right now, I think that time might just get better. And I would say that to your point about starting a company right now, it's hard. I think it's hard all the time.
Yeah.
The reason why I say that is because back in the days, it's easier to get sales, sure, because everybody had more money. But at the same time, it's not as easy to retain employees. And so the reason why is because people just have a lot more choices. Back in 2016, I had a recruiter reaching out, when I was at a job, right, at Meta. I was getting recruiter reaching out, at least twice or three times a day, for example, right? And so as you can imagine, why should I work on a startup and toil my way through if I could just have a quick payout, bigger pay package, et cetera? Now people are not as choosy, right? Because, well, you can't. So they're like, all right, well, let's actually solve problem and grind.
Yeah.
So from that perspective, it's getting easier, actually.
That's totally true. There are always different problems, and sometimes it's like completely different. But yeah, but then there are still problems. I remember in 2019, I built an engineering org from zero, 60 people at the peak, and it was extremely hard. We were working with different recruitment agencies. We were forced to allow more remote than we could have liked because it was the only option to grow faster. And now
Yeah.
that's usually not as hard today, but there are other challenges.
I want to say on that point, back in the days, right, I think that we had a lot of this cultural phenomena when time was better, that people had this notion of good vibes only, right? So we tend to not be as stressful and demanding, right, from a company's perspective. And so during that time, companies tend to move a little bit slower back in the days, and pushing on people, and all of that is just not as easy to do versus today. Back in the days, I think that Meta, Meta is a really great company, by the way. They allowed for people to have a lot of whether that's benefits or leeways or amenities to enjoy and whatnot. Now I think that time has shifted. Everybody's slimming down, right? And so on this point, actually, going back to when we talked about how this time was harder, I would say that if you want to build a viable business, it's always going to be hard. This time frame right now is actually good in the sense that people will just tell you straight up as to, hey, look, is this valuable or not, right? Versus back in the days, like 10 years ago, I think that there were apps just for everything. There were apps for sending a message without sending any text. And so you just type with emoji. I mean, you have these very funny businesses that came out during that time. Now we're all like, cutting that away because if it's not essential, it's going to be cut at this point. So it's actually really good signal in terms of that.
Yeah. I completely agree. All right. So you're a software engineer. Maybe you can tell me a bit about the stack. Which technologies did you pick? And did you over engineer at the beginning?
Sure. So we picked, as I mentioned, Cursor, and also we used Python Fast API for our backend. We deploy on GCP. We use Docker for that. And then for front end, we use React Native. Now, have we over engineered? I think that in the beginning, we definitely did a little bit more over engineering. During that time, when at the very beginning, right, when we deployed our backend, we wrote all of these unit tests and everything. And I kind of forced my only employee back in the days to write all of that. And the reason why is because we wanted to build a good engineering practice from a very early on, as opposed to, hey, we just want to move fast, and later on when we do a deployment, everything breaks and our customers get affected, and we don't know what, right? So we wanted to build that in from the very beginning. I would say that that was actually a good choice to over engineer, just because throughout our deployment, we actually capture a lot of issues. For example, recently, a couple months ago, when we did a deployment, we figured out that in our unit tests, it actually failed. And when we looked into it, it was because our third-party vendor's API was down, actually, because our account was revoked or whatever. Right? And so because of these kind of deployments, these kind of checks, we had to figure it out. And so our outage wasn't too long, on this front. So whatever we put in the very beginning, when it comes to over-engineering for quality, it actually paid back over time.
That's amazing. Because if it works, it's not over engineering. The problem of over engineering is when you build something super robust and then you need to pivot and you don't use it anymore. But if it actually scaled and now it's working, that's amazing.
Yeah, I want to say that when it comes to over engineering, it's definitely a frame of time that you look at, right? So in the very beginning, when we wrote all of these unit tests and integrated tests, end-to-end tests and whatnot, it really felt like it's over engineered because, we didn't have a customer back in the days and all that. We already put that in, right? Now, when we look back, it's like, that was a good choice.
Yeah, amazing. So yeah, the technologies you picked are my favorites as well. Usually I go for Django, which is a bit more complex than Fast API, but definitely I use this Django REST framework that generates the REST APIs, and then React Native. Yeah, I think it's a way to go. So I could have picked the same. Cool. So now switching back to the industry and the ecosystem now, is there a trend that you think everybody is underestimating?
Let me think about this. A trend. Well, I want to say that the traditional way of thinking about software, because I do get this question time to time that, hey, look, should I still learn coding, right? When it comes to, software engineering, right? Because, now you have all these AI and everything. I would say that it's still very much important. The, just that the context that you use it is a little bit different. Back in the days, right? We used to, for example, look on Stack Overflow and all of these other, websites to figure out how to do something. Now, AI can kind of do it for you. But I think that, the key here is not to, just rely on AI 100% and assume that it's going to get it correct, because most of the time it actually doesn't. What it really takes is, a person needs to really understand about, what he or she is trying to build. For example, you need to, get into very detail. For example, you can think about an entire flow, for example, but you have to get it down to, for example, your database, your schema, the type of your, data kind of level, in order for the AI to do something that actually suits, what you want it to do. there's been so many countless times where I just get lazy, right? And I tell AI, hey, just do that for me. And I've done that and it gets it wrong. And the reason is because, hey, at the end of the day, doesn't have that, as wide of a context as, humans do. For us, it really comes down to intuition, right? And so, for us to, tell you, for example, an experienced engineer to tell you, hey, how to build something and whatnot. AI is not at that level yet. And so I tend to tell people that, hey, look, it's still garbage in, garbage out. So you still have to be very crisp about what you do.
Yeah.
And, with this AI agent, this is something that software engineers use all the time is agent, right? You tell it to do something, it tells you, hey, there are the steps to do something, and then it'll do it. The thing is, you have to really watch what it does. So it's not
Yeah.
like, hey, you can just set it and forget it, right? You still have to really watch what it does, look at the logic and everything, and then you have to debate with it, say that, dude, why did you do this, right? And you have to tell it, think that like there's another function, another library, another whatever that you could use, another way of doing things instead of doing this one, right? Do it, X, Y, Z. And the other thing is the old way of doing things such as the software engineering discipline, like for example, you should separate out your environment. You should always test before, whatever, right? Like you have to have all these, safeguards engineered in. That's even more important now than ever before because here's the thing. If you can do something really fast, well, you can also do the wrong things really fast.
Yeah.
So we actually experienced that a lot. And that's where we're just like, all right, let's put all the safeguards in. Otherwise, we're going to spend a lot of time rolling back what we've done with AI just to redo it again.
Yeah. There is this saying that if a junior is using AI, is going to write junior code like 10 times faster, but it's still the junior quality. I
Yeah.
think this is interesting because today, senior, like experienced engineers like you, I've been in the industry for many years. We can use AI pretty well because we were doing things manually and now we can go faster. But what I wonder is in the future, uh, will new engineers be able to reach this quality level without going through all the process of coding, firefighting, debugging manually? I think that
Well, you can definitely
has
do
to
it.
be a way.
So you can definitely do it. And I'm sure there's a lot of publications out there telling you about how to be a good engineer, and you can definitely follow those. The only problem is that if you haven't experienced it yourself, you wouldn't know why. You want to do something like, you might know why conceptually, you might not know why from an emotional level. That's really the key here, right? Because there's nothing that beats for example, me trying to debug something 3 a.m. in the morning and, lacking sleep and, customer yelling on the other end to try to get something, done and all that, right? So that really shifts the priority in your mind. You become so much more sensitive if you've been under emotional stress dealing with
Yeah.
these kind of things. So to an extent, if you want to just get something out of the, kind of cookie cutter way of doing things, you could definitely do that. You don't have to go through the whole experience. But if you really want to, I would say, have a very strong engineer or delivering, the product consistently, that's unavoidable. You're going to have to go through a lot of these issues and feel the pain yourself.
I'm sure they're going to have other different kind of issues as difficult as we had.
Yes.
Cool. So now I'm going to ask you a more philosophical question, and this is about success. What is success for you?
I think for me, it's the ability to own my own time and do whatever I want with it. I think that, kind of going back to my roots again as an immigrant, right? Been busy pretty much from, I want to say elementary school and middle school, right? Onwards. And so, to me, part of the reason why I want to be an entrepreneur also is because, you have self control over things, right? Whatever you do, you kind of own your own success or failure. And because of that, you get to kind of own your time eventually, which, I mean, I don't have right now own.
Yeah.
But it's kind of the goal here. If I can succeed, it's really to just be able to own my own time.
So yeah, have freedom in your own time, decide on what you want to work or
Yeah,
enjoy.
exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
amazing. All right, so now you can send a message to your customers.
Yeah. So I made a post a couple of days ago actually talking about how we use AI in order to solve customer problem. And I want to say that because of the new way of doing things right. Right now, for us to solve problems, it's gotten so much more efficient, and so to us, no problem is too small for us. Our company is built all around customer satisfaction and making sure that customer get the value that they get, and so to us, we're always there to listen to our customers and to solve their pain points, no matter how small it is.
All right. So the message is they should start using AI and they can contact you to see if you can work together. And
Absolutely.
investors, are you fundraising? You're bootstrapping? Do you want to send a message to the potential investors?
Yeah, great. Thanks for the question. So we're bootstrapping at this point. Ideally, we want to make sure that we can find, a couple more customers before, we call in and say that like, look, hey, now we investment in order to scale. I'm the kind of person that, I'm risk averse. And so I would imagine that, from the investor's perspective, they want to make sure that their investment also, have a good return here. And so basically this is me de-risking also for investors. So hopefully, their money has a multiple of more than, 1x at the end.
Yeah, amazing. And to finish, what is your superpower as founder?
I think that for me, it's just that I don't really give up, I would say. I mean, that's what every founder would say. But I think that one thing also is that I tend to take this notion that I want to listen and, have at least reserve half the room to say that I might be wrong. And so I want to, first of all, listen. And number two, also reflect personally to figure out, how I can do better. So that I would say is a superpower, especially owing to my upbringing experience.
Yeah, it's super important to persevere. And I think you're in a good position now. The business starts moving and being, well, I think some people might not agree, but I think that when you're a solo founder, it's easier to keep going. Like you just need to handle yourself.
That is
So,
absolutely right. The times that founders would break up would be, oh, when the time gets tough, or actually, contrarily, when the time gets too good, then everybody's figuring out like, dude, I want more money, and that's where you get into
yeah,
fights and all of that, right? So being a solo founder, obviously, I don't have any of that. The other thing I want to add is that being a solo founder, because everything is kind of in your own head, it reduces communication costs. So for a small team and kind of earlier on, you're gonna actually move really fast. As opposed to saying that, hey, look, I gotta talk to the other guy. You know, 2 hours
yeah,
later, and then we'll brainstorm whatever.
yeah, yeah. Completely agree. All right. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed the chat. Thank you.
Thank you.